Hello, and welcome back to video number 7 in the America 2 video series. My name is still John Shar, and I will once again be your host for this video, where we will be examining the 5th problem out of the 8 biggest problems total that we face in America today, namely American national pride and American national companies being replaced by multinational companies with corporate headquarters and majority ownership outside the borders of the United States, and therefore outside the jurisdiction of America's government. Back in the day, when I was a boy, growing up in Winslow, Arizona, like most communities back then, we had community leaders who were mostly owners and operators of local businesses. All the community leaders were born and raised in Arizona, as had been, in most instances, their families on both sides. They were not just our community leaders, they were our friends and neighbors, and we all looked out for each other. All the kids went to the same schools, and the teachers talked with the parents when they met on the streets about what was going on in schools, as well as if they were having difficulty teaching some of their children. And in those days, the parents almost always sided with the teachers on matters of discipline, including corporal punishment when it was deemed necessary. I was the recipient of corporal punishment more than once, and when my parents heard about it, the teacher would call them directly. They always, 100% of the time, sided with the teachers and told me to straighten up and fly right. The kids whose parents were community leaders got their rear ends blistered with the principal's, Mr. Curtis, oak paddle, which he named the Daily Reminder, just like all the other kids when they misbehaved badly enough to warrant it. Those were the good old days, I guess, but times have changed, not only in our schools, but in our communities as well. And among the biggest changes is how citizens nowadays shop and pay for the things they buy. Mostly now, we don't really ever know the people who provide us with goods and services. We only get to know the employees of giant corporations who bought out all the small merchants or drove them out of business with lower prices for their goods and services, as the government inflated the money supply more and more, and the purchasing power of the currency bought less and less each year for most American citizens. And the businesses themselves have changed in major ways over the years, not just by getting bigger and much less personal, but more importantly in how and why they went into business in the first place. By way of comparison, let's look at how and why most businesses were started and run in the first half of the 20th century, and how they're started and run in the second half of the 20th century up until now. First, the early 20th century business model. In the early 20th century, we were a different country than we are today, and that's not all bad. Technology and invention have worked to cure diseases, make better roads possible, make long-distance travel and communications much better and easier, and we could go on and on. Nobody, and I mean nobody, wants to go back to the time before penicillin and metal and carbon implants that both lengthened lifespans and made them better. But at the same time, there is undoubtedly a widespread longing to experience life at a slower and less intrusive pace, and find a way to turn off some of the background noise that's come with the technological advances like junk mail, junk messages, and junk telephone calls, and waiting long periods of time on hold on a cell phone to talk to someone that speaks English poorly, when some of the technology you've been depending on runs off the rails and you need to get it working again. And the user manual that came with the technology is ambiguous and doesn't seem to solve your technical problem. Back in the day, when my grandfather set out to build a better life for his family, the objective was pretty simple. He built a store that carried products people needed and charged them enough so that his profits were enough to keep his family taken care of. He had no desire to build a chain of stores nationwide, boost sales through slick advertising, and sell his chain to someone or some corporation who wanted to own a lot of these chains all at the same time, and therefore make more money than he and his family could spend in a dozen lifetimes. When he was too old to run the business, he'd train and turn it over to another family member who had the same goals he had when he started the business. And if that wasn't an option, the business would likely be sold to a local competitor, or perhaps just liquidated, and the money used to supplement retirement. And business owners, for the most part, didn't advertise their wealth levels. A business owner might drive a Buick or Pontiac instead of a Chevrolet, but most of his employees drove used Fords or Chevys. But nobody drove Rolls Royces, Bentleys, Lamborghinis, Maseratis, or Ferraris just to show off. Most gave freely to charities, and while there were some families that had less income than others, no family was forced to have someone else pay for their child's lunch at school. And when someone got sick, everyone carried part of the load. Doctors and hospitals accepted patients without money or insurance and billed them for the balance, hoping for them to be able to pay as soon as possible. And for the most part, that is what happened. When the bills couldn't be paid, providers wrote them off to community service. And nobody called a lawyer to try and extort the money from the treated person or his or her family members. And when retirement time came, if the retiree didn't have enough money to pay for a separate residence, his family rearranged their house and brought him or her back in to live with them. It wasn't generally either party's first choice, but in those days, most people, including the business leaders, had to make hard choices many times throughout their lives, and nobody thought much about it. The late 20th century business model. From about 1960 on, up until today, entrepreneurs have been encouraged to think big, live large. Almost no new business is founded to be part of a community. For today's entrepreneurs, the standard for success has changed. The goal now is to be a part of a business with global ambitions. High school students whose parents have enough money and or credit to pay for 5 to 9 years of higher learning typically plan on going through 3 to 4 years of first level college, then 1 to 2 years of study at the master's level, getting an MBA, another year or doctoral studies in their preferred field, and maybe even a couple of years in law school before joining the workforce. In business schools, students will learn how franchises work, how to construct businesses to lower taxes to the lowest possible level, the legal traps to look out for, and which associations are most likely to improve networking returns, including networking with entrepreneurs in other countries. Their schools will impress on students to always remember that a sales dollar is 10 cents pre-tax, that an expense dollar is 50 cents pre-tax, and that a tax dollar is a dollar after taxes when calculating profits in terms of where they should concentrate their efforts if they're to achieve financial success. They'll be taught that political connections are often needed to get a reluctant party to vacate an area you want to expand into, and that these things are handled on a quid pro quo basis without anything in writing that might come back to hurt you or your business at a later date. In law school, they'll be taught that the actual truth doesn't matter. Instead, what people, including judges and juries, can be made to believe is true, or at least accept as true, is what matters. Being ethical is not necessary. Making people believe you are ethically grounded is necessary. All the rest is just background noise. And always work to make sure that your business is a prime takeover target for selling to someone else. In today's business world, when you sell out, you have won the game. The scrolling list on the screen shows a few of more than 1,000 once iconic American businesses that are now owned and controlled by foreign multinationals. They're gone. And they probably won't ever return. Let's talk about the wonderful world of multinationals and central banks. In the early 20th century, the federal government did not have the authority to tax citizens the way they do now. The income tax amendment to our Constitution didn't happen until 1913. That was the same year the Federal Reserve banks were created by Congress. Now, these two congressional acts are interconnected in ways that few in our country understand today. They were both hotly debated when they happened, but government, lying as usual, prevailed, and America has been paying a very, very high price for maintaining them ever since. The government didn't know how to pay their bills based on the economy that existed at that time. And the politicians didn't know how to expand the economy enough to pay their bills using the then existing tax structure. So, after growing the country without direct federal citizen taxation for 125 years, the then current majority of politicians decided to start taxing the citizens directly to help them pay the government's bills. Unfortunately, for the politicians, there were no other sources of money available to cover the amounts they wanted to spend. The banks couldn't loan them enough. And even if the banks had enough money to lend, the Constitution prohibited them from borrowing more money than the accumulated value of gold stored in the Treasury. In fact, prior to the Income Tax Amendment to our Constitution in 1913, the Constitution forbade the government from imposing any sort of direct and or unapportioned tax on the citizens. Unapportioned taxes could be spent however the politicians decided would best serve their needs. Apportioned taxes had to be spent in equal percentages to the population from which they were gathered. These safeguards, built into our Constitution by our founding fathers, to prevent politicians from both borrowing more than could be paid back, possibly bankrupting the country, and to force the politicians to spend the taxes in proportion to where they had been collected, were determined by the politicians to be too restrictive. The politicians told the citizens that the country's economic growth was being held captive to these restrictions at the constitutional level. What to do? What to do? Well, the politicians decided to remove the restrictions. No one, and I mean no one, in the populace was urging them to amend the Constitution and give the politicians unlimited authority to spend and borrow money as they alone saw fit. The Congress, urged on by their wealthiest backers, did it all on their own. Citizens were not consulted or listened to in the process, and political bagmen at the state level ratified the amendments sent to them by the Congress. And America took its first steps down the long road to oblivion. First, the government needed a reliable source of money to borrow from. Commercial banks by themselves, even the biggest ones, were not such sources. Sometimes the banks had a lot of money to lend, and other times they might be fully invested at the precise time when the government most needed more money. Existing commercial banks were therefore not considered a reliable source. They were okay for occasional backup, perhaps, but not for meeting emergencies, whether real or contrived. The Congress then set about to construct their own bank and fill it with money collected from the citizens in the form of direct and unapportioned taxes. At the time, 1913, the gold standard constitutionally mandated an act of Congress stating that only gold or silver could be considered backing money for our treasury, effectively stopped Congress from borrowing more than the stated amount of gold and silver in the nation's vaults. This restriction against unlimited borrowing would also be removed in 1972 by the Congress, both houses working together. Citizen taxes alone could no longer meet, when citizen taxes no longer could meet the government's increasing needs to cover all the government's Band-Aid payments to struggling citizens. The Band-Aid programs had been enacted over the years by politicians seeking to buy the votes of citizens when running for elected offices. Now everyone involved at the time knew it was, in effect, just a Ponzi scheme. But if only the government could prosecute, and they were the government, nobody would be able to stop it. The ideas the politicians came up with to solve the problem of not having all the money they wanted to spend was to, first, amend the Constitution as necessary to let them directly tax the citizens in any manner they seemed suitable and be allowed to spend the money in unapportioned ways as they alone saw fit. Second, create their own bank that no one was allowed to audit ever, not even the Congress. And third, ultimately, fill the bank with citizen dollars gathered through direct taxation. Now, banking laws already on the books required that they initially capitalize the new central government bank with non-citizen and non-borrowed money. To accomplish the initial capitalization of their new bank, they decided to sell shares in the bank to wealthy investors wherever they could find them. When they approached bankers and wealthy citizens in other countries about investing in their new bank, they found that none of the foreign bankers or wealthy foreign citizens trusted the other foreign bankers and other wealthy citizens enough for all of them to invest together in one large bank. And apparently, none of them trusted our politicians either. And thus was born the idea of having 12 independently owned and independently managed Federal Reserve banks scattered around the country. Now, the stated reason for the 12 banks was that they would be better able to serve different regions of the country. The real reason was that investors wealthy enough to meet the government's initial capitalizing requirements didn't trust each other and didn't trust our politicians. And separate banks were needed to entice separate foreign investors. In each instance, the capitalizing investors had three requirements if they were to participate in what everybody involved already knew was just a government-concocted Ponzi scheme. Requirement number one: the capitalizing investors had to own controlling interest in stocks in the banks they invested in. Non-voting stock could be made available for others to make investments if they wished, as most of the big commercial U.S. banks did. But the original investors' decisions regarding running the banks they invested in could not be challenged or set aside for any reason. Requirement number two: they were to be autonomous. No audits of their books was ever to be allowed, ever, by anyone, including the Congress of the United States. And requirement number three: the government of the United States had to be able to guarantee them that they would be paid no matter what if the whole Ponzi scheme somehow went south, even if they had to take the money by force of arms from America's citizens. The wealthy initial investors did not intend to be the ones left standing without a chair if and when the music stopped. And the Congress agreed to their demands. In 1913, the Congress passed Amendment number 16 to our Constitution, allowing direct taxation of citizens, and Congress spending the incoming direct taxes in totally unapportioned manners as Congress alone saw fit. State politicians only ratified the 16th Constitutional Amendment. Also in 1913, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, which explicitly agreed to the initial capitalization participant requirements as they had been dictated beforehand by the wealthy foreign investors who initially capitalized the 12 Federal Reserve banks. And in 1972, when both of these measures combined proved inadequate to keep the government afloat, Congress abolished the gold standard, which freed the politicians and the Federal Reserve banks to print up unlimited amounts of unbacked by anything money in the way of Treasury securities and treat them as if they were in fact real money. Then finally, technology provided the politicians and the Federal Reserve banks with the ability to forego the formality of actually printing up paper securities and just transfer the electronic amounts to whatever party they were being sold to, electronically, whether they were at home or abroad. Electronically. No signatures and no tracks. Now there could just be electronic images, bits and bytes flying around through the ether, only viewable by some electronic viewing device like a computer, sometimes a cell phone, and no auditing of the system by anybody. Ever. Taxes create a new world order. The multinational business world we all now live in was precipitated by the creation of the Income Tax Amendment to our Constitution. At the time the Income Tax Amendment was passed, Congress also created 12 Federal Reserve banks, primarily owned and managed by foreign interests. The government did not, at that time, have authority to borrow more than the stated amount of gold in the Treasury vault at Fort Knox, so the Federal Reserve banks would initially have to act as reserve sources for individual banks in trouble. In 1972, that would change. But at the outset, the Federal Reserve banks were kept on a short leash. The income tax, however, started making itself felt right from the outset. In the beginning, 1913, the income tax was set at a maximum of 5% of gross earnings. The average tax rate was between 3% and 0%. There were no deductions, and the poorest citizens were exempt. By 1950, the maximum tax rate was 91%, and the average rate was 50% plus. The wealthy had the politicians embed numerous deductions and exemptions in the tax code to lower their overall taxes, and the poor now had to pay taxes, but after a small standard deduction they could apply for and receive a full refund. It usually didn't amount to much. But bottom line, everyone was assessed taxes on their income, some more than others, and the original promise of a maximum tax rate of 5% is now just another dream gone south, like so many other government promises. Also, by 1950, the government was taxing returns on capital that businesses invested to help them grow. At the rate of 25% was the tax rate. Together, these income-related taxes sucked over 50% of all the money comprising the GDP out of the economy, gave it to the government, bankers, and oligarchs. And at the end of 1950, the nation's unpaid national debt stood at $257 billion. The GDP was still about 2.2 times that, $265 billion. The high, and it was high, 90% maximum personal and business tax burden was considered onerous by many business leaders, especially those in the manufacturing sector. They began looking around for ways that allowed them to keep more of what they had earned. The path they chose, increasingly often, was to begin moving some of their most expensive production and assembly processes to other countries who were less oppressive in the tax areas. The initial moves to other countries would prove to be the springboard for the building of multinational companies. By 1980, what began in the 60s as a trickle became a tsunami of production jobs being offshored. But even as early as 1972, our government was starting to get worried about the losses of jobs to other countries and started looking seriously for ways to replace the lost income and the lost taxes that was happening. Expenses didn't go down as the jobs went away. In fact, expenses increased with each job lost to other countries. Expenses relating to unemployment, food stamps, rent subsidies for those who lost their homes, and school lunches, all added to the government's bills that had to be paid. Government needed more money, and lots of it. More than they knew how to create by expanding the economy. And they needed it immediately. And the fix they hit on this time around was to borrow it from the Federal Reserve banks. The only catch was that the Constitution still forced them to limit borrowing the amount of gold and silver stored in the Treasury, and they needed more than that. They needed a lot more than that. To enable the government to borrow whatever amount they felt they needed, it would be necessary to repeal the safeguard laws that limited their borrowing to only amounts that could be paid back. And that's what Congress did in 1972. One other minor obstacle still had to be overcome. As the national debt continued to grow, a debt limit law that had been enacted as a placebo for the citizens to assure them that the debts being incurred were somehow controlled by the Congress. Since Congress could do as it pleased, this was really no control mechanism at all, but the politicians in Congress had by that time decided that the majority of Americans were pretty dull of mind and would go along with the charade. And the politicians were right. Now Congress could put on a show of concern about raising the debt limit, but a day or two before the present debt limit would prove a handicap to future spending, Congress would with much hand-wringing vote to expand the debt limit again. And now, the Ponzi scheme was finally enabled to the max. Our Treasury could now put up securities, in whatever face amounts they wished, sell them to the Federal Reserve banks, whose assets could not be audited, so we never know if they actually have the money to purchase these securities from us. Then Congress could borrow whatever amounts they wanted back from the Fed and spend the borrowed money amounts as they wished, and no one could ever audit their actions. It was the perfect crime. Sometimes the Fed would act, as a go-between between our Treasury and other countries and other wealthy investors, and sell the securities they purchased from our Treasury at a bit of a markup, and end up profiting twice from these transactions. And the Fed never paid in even $1 to create this double income source for themselves. Our politicians gave it all to them in 1913. Those initial capitalizing investors of the Fed turned out to be individually and collectively smarter than everyone in our government put together. When the Fed bails out our government or some other government, incompetent bankers, commercial interests, the payback proceeds go back to the foreign interest that we allowed to assume control over our national economy. The Fed also makes loans, buffered through other governments, to businesses as well as to our government. Many of the multinational companies have been recipients of Fed handouts. The multinational companies spend the buffered money they borrowed from the Fed to build factories and businesses in other countries, thereby growing the foreign countries' workforces at the expense of our own, while escaping all taxation on themselves and their businesses. And then our government expands the debt limit again so that we can funnel even more money to the Fed to spend somewhere other than in America. Our government has put the citizens in the position of having to pay for their own destruction. The multinational companies that emerged over the past 75 years have been fundamentally different from the multinational companies of prior decades and centuries, like the Hudson's Bay Company or the East India Company. Prior centuries, multinational companies retained a feeling of nationalistic pride associated with the country they operated from. But the multinational companies, American-based and other country-based, that have emerged in our generation have no such pride in their makeup. The present-day multinational company, regardless of country of origin and regardless of public relations claims to the contrary, bears no allegiance to any country. Instead, the allegiance of multinational companies today is wholly and entirely to the company's stockholders. By 1980, the biggest U.S.-based multinational companies had moved some or most of their production-based operations offshore, and they began moving politically to secure the gains made through doing so. Congress was lobbied intensely to open up completely the U.S. market to imports completely free of any import tariffs at all, to be accomplished over a period of time. Doing this would maximize their profits on goods produced outside of the United States. And in 1994, after much debate, the Congress agreed to businesses' demands to not tax goods they produced outside the U.S. when the foreign-produced goods were imported back into the U.S. for sale to Americans. The rise of the multinational companies, bearing no allegiance to no country or group of citizens other than their stockholders, is a relatively recent event. Prior generations and prior centuries had in their makeup large companies with worldwide operations. This is nothing new. What is new is the attitude of such companies that they should bear no allegiance to the country that spawned them, made them rich and powerful, or the workers of their native country. The present day multinational company, regardless of country of origin and also regardless of public relations claims to the contrary, bears no allegiance to any country. Instead, the allegiance of multinational companies today is wholly and entirely to the company's stockholders. And increasingly, the stockholders of U.S.-based multinational companies are citizens of foreign countries who, not surprisingly, could care less what happens to workers of the multinational companies who aren't citizens of their own country. Over the past 4 decades, a number of disastrous government policies relating to money creation, money collecting, money allocating, and money borrowing, and direct and unapportioned taxes have brought us to a point in time where a majority of American citizens and American businesses have come to think of themselves as owing allegiance first to some profit-making enterprise based in another country, and to a nebulous economic philosophy promoted by their government based entirely on unfounded, discredited, and proven false economic principles, rather than owing allegiance to the idea that is America. And that is most certainly a problem. And I guess that's about it for this video session. Thanks again for watching and listening. And thanks for caring about our country and wanting to make it and us be all we can be together. Be well.